When a farmer from a small town bought a huge rusted ship and placed it in the middle of his field, everyone thought he had lost his mind. People laughed and asked why a man who had never seen the ocean needed a ship. But one day the sky changed. Rain that was supposed to bring life turned into a nightmare. The water began to rise rapidly, and no one understood why until it was too late. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. And ask yourself, would you believe that this ship would save an entire valley? The morning sun crawled slowly over the edge of the distant hills, its light stretching across the wide open plains, like a pale hand brushing away the darkness. For most people in the small rural community of Dry Creek, sunrise meant another ordinary day feeding livestock, checking fences, repairing tools worn down by wind and time. But for the man who lived at the far edge of the town, at the end of a lonely dirt road that curved between fields of dying grass, sunrise had begun to feel less like a beginning and more like a reminder. Another day without his father. Another day when the house felt too quiet, too still. Another day that looked exactly like the ones before it. Tom Reeves stood on the sagging wooden porch of his farmhouse, a chipped enamel mug of coffee warming his hands. The rich smell of earth and hay drifted faintly from the barn behind him. He glanced toward the horizon where the sun finally broke free, casting a golden ribbon across the fields. It should have been a comforting sight, the kind of view people painted on postcards or kept as screensavers. But for Tom, it only brought a familiar ache, a soft, steady pressure somewhere deep in his chest. The house creaked under him, an old, weary structure that had been built by his grandfather and maintained by his father. Tom had inherited it along with everything else: the debts, the tools, the rusting tractor, and the quiet responsibilities that came with being a farmer whose land had been in his family for generations. He was in his early 40s, though the lines along his eyes made him look older, etched there by sun, wind, and worry. His hands were the hands of someone who worked the land broad, calloused, roughened by years of gripping plows, repairing fences, and milking cows. His face carried the lasting impression of a man who rarely slept enough and who almost never asked for help. There was a plainness to him, but not the weak kind. He had the straightforward look of someone who endured, who kept going even when things crumbled around him. Inside the house, quiet reigned, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that lives in places where someone is missing. His father had been gone for nearly 5 years, but some days it felt like 5 minutes. Tom could still see him sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, leaning over a stack of old newspapers or dog-eared maritime magazines, talking in that low, steady voice about ships, oceans, and places far beyond the boundaries of their small rural world. It had been his father's greatest dream to sail, not on a tiny fishing boat or a simple canoe, but on a real vessel, something sturdy and steel-bound. He could describe hulls, engines, cabins, decks, and navigation systems with the knowledge of a man who had never seen the ocean up close, but loved it with all his heart. He had collected every scrap of information he could find about ships, filling a dusty shelf with pictures, diagrams, and books, always telling his son that, "One day, Tom, we'll have a boat of our own." Tom had always nodded, and as a boy he had believed it. But life had a way of pulling dreams from a man's hands, and they had never gotten close to owning anything that floated. Bills had piled up, roof leaks had demanded fixing, tools had needed replacing, and his father's health had declined too fast. When he died, he left Tom not with the captain's hat he always joked about buying, but with a promise, one that Tom had made at the hospital bedside. A promise to build something, to finish something, to not let another generation of Reeves men live and die without touching the horizon. Tom had murmured the promise quietly, pressing his forehead against his father's hand, though at the time he had no idea what fulfilling it would even look like. The following years had slipped by in slow repetition. Dry Creek was kind to no one, and the weather grew harsher with each passing season. Summers were dry enough to crack the soil like brittle glass, and winters brought sudden storms that beat viciously against the rooftops. Tom's farm had managed to stay afloat, not comfortably so, but enough to survive. Enough for him to keep the animals fed, the fields manageable, the house from falling apart entirely. It was a life of routine comforting in its predictability, suffocating in its sameness. He filled his evenings with small repairs, with sorting through old tools, with cleaning and recleaning parts of the barn. But no matter what he did, the house always felt one voice too quiet. Then one chilly morning in early autumn, everything changed with a single, folded newspaper left at the local store counter. Tom had stopped in town to buy animal feed, stepping into the little supply store with the usual nod at the owner. As he paid, his eyes drifted to a bold-lettered headline on the front page of a discarded paper: Auction of Decommissioned Maritime Equipment and Vessels. Underneath a list of items was printed engine parts, navigational consoles, metal scrap from dismantled docks, and, at the bottom, a line so absurd he had to read it twice. Lot number 47, decommissioned cargo vessel, severe rusting, requires independent transport from site. Price negotiable. For a moment, Tom simply stared at the words, not quite believing them. A ship? A real ship? The idea was ridiculous. The ocean was hundreds of miles away. Transporting a cargo vessel to a farm made no sense at all. It was impractical, expensive, unnecessary. But the moment he read it, something in him snapped awake. He stood there, the cold air from the open door brushing his neck, staring at the paper like a man staring into a window of his own past. His father's voice echoed faintly in his mind ships, dreams, faraway places. The way his father used to describe metal hulls with reverence, as though they were built from hope instead of steel. Tom folded the newspaper under his arm and left the store without saying goodbye. The rest of that day passed in a haze. While feeding the cattle, he could think of little else. When he repaired a broken gate hinge, he saw flashes of rusted metal plates under his tools. While cleaning out the barn, he found himself imagining the interior of a ship, dark, abandoned, waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. By nightfall, he had found the auction office number printed at the bottom of the article. He sat at the kitchen table, the old rotary phone beside him, staring at the sheet of paper. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small lamp that flickered with age. He poured himself a glass of water, took a sip, and rested his hands on the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips. His father's wood, sanded and stained by a man who had always dreamed bigger than his circumstances allowed. He told himself it was a terrible idea. The logistics alone would be a nightmare. Transporting a rusted cargo ship across dry land required machinery he had never even seen before. The cost would eat into his savings. The neighbors would talk. The whole town would think he'd lost his mind. But promises had a way of resurfacing exactly when life felt smallest. He lifted the receiver, dialed the number with slow, hesitant motions, and waited. When the voice on the other end answered, he cleared his throat, not trusting himself. "I'm calling about Lot 47, he said, surprised at how steady his own voice sounded. "The cargo ship." The conversation that followed felt unreal. The representative explained the condition of the ship: old, weather-worn, structurally tired, rusted along the hull. It had been intended for scrap, but the scrapyard had recently gone out of business. No one else had shown interest. If Tom could handle transportation, they would lower the price significantly. Everything about it was irrational. And yet, an hour later, Tom Reeves signed the purchase agreement. In the days that followed, the entire town buzzed with curiosity. People whispered in the aisles of the grocery store. They nudged one another at the gas station. Children pointed when he drove by. Word spread quickly. Tom Reeves had bought a ship. Not a boat, a ship. And when, a week later, a convoy of massive transport trucks rumbled down the dirt road toward his farm, most of the town followed on foot or by car, gathering along the fields like spectators at a parade. Dust clouds rose into the air as the trucks groaned under their load, carrying an enormous rusted vessel that looked as though it had been ripped from the bottom of the sea. The sight was surreal. A steel giant with a backbone of faded red paint, its hull pitted and broken in places, windows shattered or boarded over, and the remnants of its name barely visible beneath crusted layers of rust. It was so out of place among the golden grasses and rolling fields that onlookers burst into laughter. Someone joked loudly that Tom had lost his mind. Someone else called it The world's first landlocked navy. A few clapped mockingly as the ship was maneuvered into place on his property, the ground vibrating under the massive weight. Tom stood beside it as it settled into the dirt, his arms crossed over his chest. He heard the laughter. He saw the pointing fingers. He felt the sting of mockery, but none of it mattered not compared to the quiet warmth blooming in his chest. The ship had come home. His father's dream had taken shape in steel. When the trucks left and the crowds dispersed, the field fell silent once more. The wind rustled the tall grass. A lone hawk circled overhead. Tom approached the ship slowly, running his fingers along the cold, rough surface of its hull. It felt ancient, wounded, forgotten, yet patient, as though it had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to see past the rust. That evening, with the sun sinking behind the hills, Tom walked through the ship's interior for the first time. Dust thickened the air. Loose cables dangled. The floors creaked under his boots. But in the fading orange light, he could almost see his father walking beside him, nodding silently at each corridor. He spent that night on the deck, seated against the rail, watching the stars flicker through the darkening sky. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, maybe, or hope. A quiet stirring that whispered, "You're not done yet." In the weeks that followed, he began the slow, taxing work of restoration. He cut away the worst rust, welded new plates into place, swept away broken debris, and repaired sections of the interior. Every day after tending to the animals and fields, he returned to the ship. It became a routine one that soothed him in ways he didn't fully understand. The rhythm of metal against metal, the hiss of welding sparks, the smell of fresh paint. These things filled the empty spaces in his heart. People still laughed, but their laughter grew less sharp. Some shook their heads when they passed by on the road. Others simply whispered as though observing something they couldn't quite categorize. Tom ignored them all. He wasn't building a ship for them. He wasn't even building it for himself. He was building it for a promise. And though he didn't know it yet, the world around him was slowly shifting, preparing for something no one in Dry Creek was ready for, something that would soon turn every whisper, every joke, every doubt into stunned silence. Something that would make his ship more necessary than anyone could have imagined. The first hints of trouble came so quietly that at first Tom barely noticed them. In Dry Creek, weather was usually predictable, a stubborn, unchanging rhythm that cycled between long months of dryness and brief, impatient storms that vanished as quickly as they came. Most years, Tom prayed for rain, as other men prayed for fortunes. Rain meant life. Rain meant the cattle could graze freely, the soil could loosen, the seeds could breathe. But that year, the sky behaved like a stranger wearing a familiar face. It began with a drizzle that arrived out of nowhere one late afternoon. Tom had been standing on the lower deck of the ship, tightening bolts along a patched section of the hull, when he felt the faint tap of water against his neck. He looked up, expecting to see a passing cloud. Instead, the entire sky had dimmed to a pale, uniform gray, stretching endlessly in every direction. The drizzle thickened into a steady rain. Tom paused, wiping the water from his brow with the back of his hand. The rain didn't feel threatening, just unexpected. Dry Creek rarely saw showers outside of seasonal storms, and even then, the land drank them up greedily, leaving almost no trace behind. That evening, the ground softened only slightly. Tom had enjoyed the brief coolness the rain brought to the air. It made his work on the ship feel lighter somehow, as if nature was offering him a small reprieve after long, sun-baked months. But the following morning, when he stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, he noticed something peculiar. Thin patches of moisture still clung to the soil, refusing to vanish with the rising sun. He frowned. Usually, any sign of water disappeared overnight, but the earth seemed unwilling to let this rain go. The next day brought another downpour, and then another. Soon it became a patterned, soft rain in the morning, steady rain by the late afternoon, and long, whispering showers at night that drummed against the roof until Tom half expected to find leaks in the ceiling. He didn't mind it at first. The land needed it. The animals lingered contentedly under the shelter of the barn, listening to the rhythm of water as though it soothed them. But after a week of nonstop rain, the mood shifted. On the far edge of his fields, Small puddles began forming in the shallow dips between the rows of grass. Tom crouched beside one of them, dipping his fingers into the cool water. It wasn't deep, but it was stubborn. Even on days when the rain eased for a few hours, the puddles didn't shrink. It was as if the ground had grown tired of absorbing so much. A low worry started settling into Tom's thoughts, crawling around the edges of his routine. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Weather changed all the time. Seasons sometimes behaved oddly. It wasn't the first year Dry Creek had seen unusual conditions. And yet, as he walked toward the ship that afternoon, he caught sight of something that made him slow to a halt. Directly beneath the hull, where weeks earlier there had been nothing but dry dirt and dust-shallow pools, now reflected the dull sky above. Thin rivulets of rainwater trickled slowly toward the ship, forming small currents around its base. Tom knelt down, touching the ground beneath the water. The soil had turned soft and spongy, like dough mixed too wet. His boots sank deeper than usual when he stood back up. He looked around the field, noting how the grass shimmered with moisture. A faint heaviness hung in the air, not just humidity, but something thicker, oppressive, like a pressure that settled invisibly across the land. Later that day, as he finished repairing a cracked railing on the ship's upper deck, he turned on the small battery-powered radio he kept nearby. His father had always listened to radio weather reports with the seriousness other men reserved for news about wars or politics. Tom, in habit, kept listening too. The announcer's voice was calm, perhaps too calm, as he mentioned higher than average water levels in the Clearwater River and ongoing heavy rains in the region. The man spoke with the same practiced steadiness that officials used when they wanted to avoid sounding alarmed. Tom wiped the sweat, or was it rain, from his forehead and stood still, listening. The announcer assured listeners that the local dam, an old but important structure upstream, was holding steady. Engineers were closely monitoring the situation, and residents had no cause for concern at this time. Those last words made something flicker in Tom's chest, something he couldn't quite place. No cause for concern at this time. People only said that when concern was exactly what they were trying to keep quiet. He switched off the radio and returned to work, but the words lingered like a low hum in the back of his mind. That night he woke to a strange sound. At first he thought it was thunder, but as he listened more closely, he realized it wasn't sharp enough, nor did it roll across the sky like a storm. It was a distant, continuous vibration, low, almost metallic. The windows rattled subtly, barely perceptible unless one was fully awake. Tom got out of bed, opened the front door, and peered out into the darkness. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, barely visible except when it caught the glow of the porch light. The sound was coming from far away, somewhere in the direction of the river or perhaps beyond it. A part of him wondered if construction crews had begun reinforcing the dam, but the hour was too late for that. The ground beneath his feet felt different too, softer. As he stepped onto the dirt path, his boots sank deeper than usual, water squelching faintly around the edges. He scanned the horizon, but the night hid everything in shadow. No lightning, no thunder. Just that peculiar vibration, like the groan of something old being pushed past its limits. Over the next several days, townsfolk began to talk. At the feed store, an older man mentioned that his lower pasture was more swamp than land. A woman at the gas station said she saw the river creeping up the banks near her property, swallowing the reeds. Someone joked that if the rain kept up, Dry Creek would need a fleet rather than a fire department. Some chuckled, some didn't. Tom tried to shrug off the unease, but each day the signs grew harder to ignore. Windrows of debris appeared along the edges of the fields, pushed there by creeping water. The roadside ditches transformed into murky flowing trenches. Bridges sagged slightly as the soil beneath them shifted. Even the animals sensed something changing. His cattle were restless, pacing near the fences, lifting their noses to the air, as if smelling something distant and unfamiliar. And the ship, once a static, earthbound monument, began to look strangely at home among the encroaching water. Standing beside it one evening, Tom observed how the pools around its base had grown wider, deeper. The hull's reflections shimmered like a wavering ghost across the surface. He pressed his boot down again experimentally, and the earth seemed to give a little more than before. A tremor of unease ran through him, though he tried to smother it with practicality. Still, a thought he didn't voice, didn't even want to think, coiled somewhere beneath his ribs. What if the water didn't stop? He returned to the ship daily, restoring what he could, inventing new excuses to strengthen parts of the structure he hadn't initially planned to work on. He inspected the bilge compartments, tested the emergency lights he had wired himself, and even reinforced the lower interior panels with metal sheets salvaged from an old grain silo. He told himself it was all part of the restoration, but there was a different kind of urgency in his movements now. One afternoon, while fastening a panel inside the engine room, he heard a crackling voice on the radio. The announcer sounded tenser than before. The Clearwater River was at record seasonal height. The dam continued to withstand pressure, but the water level was approaching the maximum limit for safe discharge. The last line made Tom freeze mid-motion. Residents should remain attentive to updates and stay indoors during heavy weather. Stay indoors. The phrase struck him as wrong somehow. If anything were truly dangerous, they would advise evacuation. And yet they hadn't. Not even close. Tom climbed out of the ship's belly and stood on the deck, staring at the land around him. The fields no longer looked like fields. They resembled shallow marshes stretching toward the horizon. The sky overhead was swollen with lead-colored clouds, pressing low and heavy. Rain fell in thin needles but seemed endless nonetheless. From the road, he heard the faint sputtering of an approaching vehicle. A neighbor drove by, slowed down to look at Tom, then at the ship, then back at Tom. He offered a strained grin and shouted something half-joking about how Tom's ship might finally see action soon. Tom managed a small smile, but inside a cold truth settled into him. The rain wasn't stopping. The ground wasn't absorbing it. The river wasn't slowing down. The dam wasn't invincible. Every instinct he had, every inherited whisper of caution from generations of farmers who'd learned to read the land like a second language, told him the same thing. Something was coming. Something the town wasn't prepared for. Something that would test not only the land's strength, but his own. And as the rain continued, tapping against the ship's deck like a steady heartbeat, Tom felt the first true tremor of fear that soon the promise he made to his father might take on a meaning he had never anticipated. The rain did not stop. By the time the third week rolled across the horizon, the sky had become a constant, brooding presence, an unbroken span of shifting gray that pressed down on the land like a heavy hand. Day and night blurred into one endless curtain of water that never thinned, never softened. The sound of it had become the town's new heartbeat, steady, relentless, and strangely hollow. Dry Creek, a place usually defined by sun-scorched soil and brittle winds, seemed swallowed by an unfamiliar world. For Tom, the transformation happened slowly at first. Each morning he stepped outside, the hems of his jeans brushing against taller and wetter grass. The ground no longer felt firm beneath his boots. Instead, it yielded with a wet, sucking resistance, as though the earth itself had grown weary of trying to hold together under the weight of so much water. On mornings when the rain briefly dwindled to a soft mist, Tom would take a slow walk across the fields, seeing how the puddles had spread, merging into wide sheets of murky water that reflected the gray sky like tarnished mirrors. The cattle grew uneasy. They paced along the edge of the pastures, their hooves sinking deeper each day. Some low-lying areas of the property were no longer usable. Small lakes formed there, the tall grass beneath them bending and swaying like underwater seaweed. Tom tried moving the animals to higher ground, but even those places were beginning to soften and blur under the heavy downpour. It was around this time that the roads began to fail. What used to be dusty tracks turned into long stretches of mud-ridden trenches. Tires sank, engines sputtered, and several people abandoned their vehicles completely. Tom's truck struggled as well. Twice he nearly got stuck trying to haul feed from the supply store. He had to leave it parked near the barn and give up on long drives altogether. The idea of traveling to town became quietly daunting. Without realizing it, Tom began rationing his trips, knowing each one risked leaving him stranded in the rising sludge. Inside his house, the electricity flickered more often than he cared to admit. The lights dimmed unpredictably, humming in the way they only did when too much of the grid was compromised. Sometimes the power vanished entirely for several hours, only to return without explanation. Tom bought extra lantern oil and kept his generator ready, though he hesitated to use it unless absolutely necessary. The rain had a way of making every mundane task feel layered with tension, as though life itself was walking across a floor that might collapse at any moment. Despite the growing unease around him, Tom spent more and more time inside the ship. The vessel had become something of a sanctuary, solid, enclosed, strangely comforting with its thick metal walls and echoing interior. Each time he stepped inside, shaking off rainwater and mud, he felt sheltered from the world outside. But the more time he spent there, the more he noticed small changes he couldn't ignore. The water around the ship was rising. What had once been puddles no deeper than a boot print now pooled halfway up the first layer of stones he kept near the hull for reinforcement. When he pressed his foot onto the ground, it slipped almost immediately, sinking several inches into the mud. Beneath that mud, he could feel something shifting slowly, but undeniably. The land had lost its firmness, the soil losing its grip on the shape it once held. Still, he tried to maintain normalcy. One morning he climbed inside the hull, carrying a bucket of tools, determined to continue reinforcing the lower compartments. The air inside felt different, humid, heavy, with a faint metallic scent that seemed sharper than usual. He crouched near a panel he had installed weeks earlier and tested its stability. The screws held firmly. The sealant remained intact. But as he hammered a bolt into a fresh plate of metal, a faint vibration tickled through the structure. He paused, his hand hovering above the tool. The vibration wasn't internal, it came from the ground beneath him. A slow, subtle tremor that lasted no more than a second. He frowned and waited. Nothing. He continued working, but the moment stayed with him, persistent as a splinter. Later that afternoon, when the rain paused just long enough to let a dim, muted light seep through the clouds, Tom walked toward the back pasture where he kept an old wooden fence. The walk was slow. Each step required effort as the muddy ground clinged and pulled at his boots. When he reached the fence, he saw that half of it was already submerged. Only the top rail remained visible above the expanding pool of water that had swallowed the lower posts. Bits of hay and debris floated near the edges. As he stood there staring across the rising wetlands, he heard an engine grumble down the nearby road. A neighbor, Mark Turner, drove up in his pickup, one of the last trucks in the area that still managed to navigate the drowning terrain. He parked near Tom's driveway, rolled down the window, and called out. Tom approached, bracing himself against the slick ground. Mark looked pale, his hat soaked, his clothes darkened with water. He gestured toward the flooded field and shook his head. "You seeing all this?" he asked. Tom nodded. Mark sighed and leaned back in his seat. "Lower part of my land's gone under. Been moving the cattle all morning. It's getting worse, Tom. A lot worse." Tom didn't need to be told. He could see it with his own eyes in every inch of the land. The rain had begun swallowing the world piece by piece. "I heard something about the dam," Mark continued, lowering his voice a little. "A buddy of mine works up near Clearwater. Says they're running the floodgates nonstop. Says the lake's rising faster than they can dump the water out." Tom frowned. The dam was supposed to be holding steady. "That's what they're saying on the news," Mark said, a short, humorless laugh escaping him. "But my buddy says engineers are worried. There's cracks they didn't mention in the reports. Small ones, but cracks all the same." Tom felt the cold dread of confirmation sink into his stomach. The strange vibrations, the hard rain, the saturated ground, it all connected. Mark wiped the fog off his windshield with the back of his hand. "If this keeps up," he said quietly, "we're going to have more than just flooded fields to worry about." After Mark left, Tom lingered outside a while, letting the rain fall against his face. The drizzle had picked up again, heavier now. He felt it running down the collar of his shirt, chilling him, but his mind was far from his soaked clothes. The dam. That aging concrete barrier had stood for decades, holding back the force of the great reservoir above the valley. If the lake was rising faster than expected, if cracks were forming, even small ones. He turned toward the ship and felt something twist inside him, an uneasy realization that didn't want to be named. Over the next few days, the rain turned from steady to violent. Sheets of water battered the fields morning and night. The ditches overflowed, carrying branches and leaves in swirling brown currents. One afternoon, the power went out again, this time for nearly a full day. When it returned, the lights flickered with a skittish rhythm that made Tom think twice before trusting them. The cattle refused to wander far from the barn. They stood close together, restless, as if sensing a predator they couldn't see. Birds disappeared entirely. Even the hardy blackbirds that perched near the barn vanished. The whole valley seemed to hold its breath. Then came the moment that made Tom finally understand the gravity of the situation. He was standing near the ship at sunset. Not that the sun had been visible through the thick sky for days, when he noticed how the hull no longer sat as firmly in the mud as before. Instead of feeling anchored, the vessel seemed to shift ever so slightly when he put his weight against it. He pressed harder, and again. There was a faint give like the earth beneath it was no longer solid ground, but an unstable mixture of water and sand. He backed away slowly, scanning the field with new eyes. What used to be dry land was now a shallow lake stretching well beyond the barn. The water lapped gently at the wooden posts, swirling lazily as if testing how much further it could advance. He could no longer distinguish where the fields ended and the wetlands began. They had blended into one vast, sprawling sheet of murky water. He knew then, with a clarity he did not want, that the land was losing its fight. The dam, the rising water, the constant rain, it all pointed toward a single suffocating truth. The storm was not random. It was not temporary. It was not something that would dry up and disappear after a few sunny days. Something much bigger was building. Something that would not stop at flooded pastures. Something that would soon come for the town, the farms, and everything standing on this fragile, waterlogged land. And if, when it arrived, Dry Creek would be utterly unprepared. Standing before the ship he had restored in memory of his father, rain soaking into his clothes and dripping from the brim of his hat, Tom felt the first undeniable certainty that the promise he had thought belonged only to the past was about to collide with the present in a way he could never have imagined. The water was rising, and the world he knew was drowning. By the time the fourth week of rain arrived, the sky had become a suffocating ceiling, heavy and swollen, as if the clouds themselves were sinking lower with every passing hour. What had begun as unusual weather had turned into something monstrous, something that pressed on the land and its people with quiet, relentless force. Even inside his home, Tom felt the storm, its pulse, its weight, its steady assault that seeped into everything. The world had become damp and trembling at the edges, and every breath he took tasted faintly of metal and moisture. That final day before the disaster began, like all the others, rain drummed on the roof, slid in streaks across the window panes, and pooled beneath every slope and depression on the property. Tom stepped outside into the cool, wet air and paused. The rain was heavier than the day before, not just thicker, but fiercer, like fingers beating against the earth. The wind had begun to howl in long, moaning gusts, carrying with it branches, leaves, and bits of debris from the valley. Tom pulled the hood of his jacket over his head and trudged across the yard toward the barn to check on the cattle. They stood huddled together, their bodies tense, their eyes wide and watchful. Animals always sensed danger before people did, and now they behaved like the world around them was unraveling. The barn roof rattled under each gust of wind, and Tom found himself glancing up more than once, imagining it peeling away like a flimsy sheet of paper. He soothed the animals as best he could, though he knew his voice meant little against the storm's fury. His boots sank deeper into the mud every time he took a step. The ground no longer felt like ground at all. It felt like a membrane stretched over something churning beneath. By mid-afternoon, the rain intensified into something violent. Sheets of water cascaded down from the sky with such force that visibility shrank to only a few yards. The trees on the far side of the property blurred into ghostly silhouettes, and the fields beyond them disappeared entirely behind the pounding rain. Tom could barely hear anything beyond the roar, the storm drowning out all other sounds. Late in the day, the radio crackled to life in the kitchen. Tom rushed inside, shaking off the water as he crossed the threshold. The announcer's voice, usually composed, sounded strained, brittle around the edges. Reports indicated that the Clearwater Dam's levels had reached a critical point. Safety measures were being enacted. Residents were advised to stay indoors and avoid unnecessary travel. The man's voice caught slightly before he forced it steady again. Engineers are doing everything they can, he said, but it was a line without conviction. And then at the end, please remain attentive for emergency alerts. Tom switched off the radio. A deep, uneasy quiet filled the kitchen, despite the storm's roar outside. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Anyone could hear it in the announcer's voice. Anyone who had lived near a dam long enough knew what critical truly meant. Tom's mind replayed the earlier words. Avoid unnecessary travel. Stay indoors. Remain attentive. Warnings disguised as reassurances. The rest of the evening passed with an eerie tension. Tom returned to the ship, checking for any last-minute adjustments he could make. The hull groaned under the force of the wind, and water slapped against its metal sides like hands trying to climb aboard. Tom tightened bolts that didn't need tightening, tested lights he had tested hundreds of times before, and stood in the wheelhouse listening to the storm rage around him. Every instinct inside him screamed that something huge was approaching, something he could not stop or outrun. Night arrived abruptly. There was no sunset, only a thickening of darkness as the storm grew bolder. The rain turned deafening. The wind slammed against the walls of the ship with such force it felt like the metal shuddered in protest. Tom stepped outside onto the deck, gripping the railing as gusts pushed hard against him. The world had become a blur. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating vast waves of rain that moved sideways under the wind's command. He had never seen weather like this. Then, in the heart of that suffocating night, it happened. It began with a sound like a distant explosion, so low and deep it vibrated inside the bones rather than the ears. Tom froze. The ground vibrated, a sickening pulse that rippled through the fields, up the hull of the ship and into his legs. The cattle in the barn bellowed in panic. Birds, despite the storm, took to the sky in a chaotic burst. The wind faltered for a brief moment, as if even the storm paused to listen. Then came the second sound, a monstrous, ripping crack, louder, sharper, unmistakable. It tore through the valley like the roar of an ancient beast awakening from a century of sleep. The ground heaved beneath Tom's boots. He grabbed the railing with both hands as the ship lurched slightly. A shock wave of vibrating air swept across the land, and in that moment Tom knew, without needing confirmation, that the dam had broken. He could almost picture it, concrete fracturing like brittle stone, water bursting through the rupture with unthinkable force, tearing away everything in its path as it hurled itself down the valley. The Clearwater Reservoir held enough water to swallow entire towns. Now all that water had been released at once. The first wave arrived faster than Tom expected. It swept across the lower valley in a violent surge, engulfing fences, machinery, sheds, and the first line of houses in its unstoppable rush. From where he stood, he saw the landscape shift, the fields transforming into a churning river. Closer and closer it came, swallowing the landmarks he knew so well. His heart thundered in his chest, but he didn't move. He could only watch as nature's fury devoured everything in its path. The water reached his property with a deafening crash, slamming into the wooden posts around the fields and ripping them free in seconds. It surged toward the barn, rising around its base as though trying to lift it. The cattle screamed in terror, and Tom dashed off the deck, stumbling through the pouring rain as he ran toward them. The wind tore at him. The water pulled at his legs like hands desperate to drown him. He reached the barn door just as the water rose over his boots, forcing it open against the pressure. The animals were frantic. He could not save them all, not alone, not in that moment. But he cut the ropes that tethered the ones closest to him, pushing and shouting, urging them to leave through the open door. Some bolted, splashing through the rising flood. Others froze, too terrified to move. The barn shuddered violently as water battered its walls, and Tom realized he had seconds at most. He rushed toward his truck instinctively, only to see it already half submerged and drifting sideways as the water carried it away. The roar of the flood grew louder. The ground beneath him vibrated like a drum, The water rose to his knees, then his thighs. Tom gasped at the cold, fighting to stay upright as the current pulled with growing strength. He turned toward the ship, the one solid shape in the chaos, still clinging to the ground but trembling under the assault. With every ounce of strength he had left, Tom stumbled through the water, grabbing whatever he could to steady himself. By the time he reached the ship, the flood had reached its hull, swirling violently around it. The ground beneath the vessel shifted, slumped, and then liquefied as the soil gave way entirely. Tom scrambled up the gangway, slipping twice before he managed to grab the railing and pull himself aboard. He collapsed onto the deck, gasping, his heart smashing against his ribs. The ship groaned deeply, a sound like a sleeping giant waking from a long slumber. And then, slowly, impossibly, the ship began to rise. Tom crawled toward the edge and looked over. The vessel was no longer resting on Earth. The violent floodwaters had lifted it, freeing it from the land where it had stood immobile for months. The world below had become a restless sea, swirling with debris and shattered pieces of what once were homes and barns and fences. The ship, his father's dream, was floating. Tom rose to his feet, gripping the railing as the vessel rocked under him. Lightning illuminated the horizon for a split second, revealing the wild, churning expanse that had replaced the valley. He felt a dizzying mix of awe, terror, and disbelief. The land was gone. The night had swallowed everything. But he had a ship. For the first time since the rain began, Tom understood that his father's dream had not been foolish, not strange, not laughable. It had been waiting. And now that the world was drowning, the one thing everyone had mocked was the only thing that could survive it. He wiped the rain from his eyes, breathing heavily. The storm raged around him, the wind screaming like a living thing. But Tom felt something shift deep inside him, something sharp and clear as steel. The ship was afloat, and now it was time to decide what he would do with it. The floodwaters surged and twisted around the ship, pushing it this way and that as if testing its strength. The metal groaned beneath Tom's boots, the hull flexing slightly with every pulse of the current. He stood on the deck for several long seconds, gripping the railing while the world reeled beneath him, trying to steady his breath as realization caught up with him. The land had disappeared under a violent churning sea. What had once been his fields, barn, fences, and the familiar slopes of Dry Creek had been transformed into a vast, muddy expanse of water, debris, and chaos. But his ship, his impossible, landlocked ship, was afloat. The flood roared like 1,000 storms combined. But inside Tom, a different kind of storm was forming, one laced with urgency and purpose. There was no time to marvel, no time to fear, no time to question how any of this could be real. People would be trapped. Families would be stranded in houses that were never built to withstand a sudden ocean. Children, the elderly, neighbors, strangers, they would all be caught in the same nightmare. And there he was, standing on the only vessel in the valley capable of moving through the catastrophe. The ship rocked violently as another surge slammed into the hull, jolting Tom back into action. He stumbled just once before regaining his balance, then dashed across the deck and down into the interior. His boots clanged against the metal steps as he descended into the engine room, where he had spent countless hours repairing outdated systems, wiring circuits, and replacing rusted parts. Now all that work, every scraped knuckle, and sleepless night mattered in a way he had never imagined. He fumbled for the controls, hands slick with rainwater and mud, and flicked the switches in rapid sequence. The generator coughed, sputtered, and roared to life with a deep, satisfying rumble. Lights flickered on throughout the ship, dim at first, then brightening into a steady glow. The interior hummed as pumps engaged. The emergency panels blinked to life, and every system he had fixed or patched or jury-rigged announced its readiness. Tom ran tested hands along the walls, feeling the ship vibrate beneath his fingers. It was alive. The vessel was alive in a way it had never been on land, as though the water had awakened a sleeping beast. He hurried to the wheelhouse, climbing the final ladder with determination, and threw open the door. The storm raged beyond the windows, sheets of rain slamming against the glass. Tom turned on the searchlights, angling them across the waterlogged landscape. The beams cut through the darkness like white daggers, illuminating the horror below: floating pieces of wood, overturned barrels, sections of roofs, and what looked like half a porch drifting aimlessly. The wheel felt strange in his hands, not unfamiliar, but heavier, alive with movement as the ship swayed. Tom had never captained anything bigger than an old fishing boat on a summer trip decades ago, but something within him understood the basics. He steered cautiously, keeping the vessel pointed toward where the main road had once cut through the valley. Now it was nothing more than a faint path beneath the water, marked only by telephone poles whose top halves stuck out like skeletal arms reaching for help. Tom guided the ship forward slowly at first, testing how it responded to the current. The hull resisted the rushing water, then found a rhythm of its own. It wasn't graceful. The vessel drifted, shuddered, and groaned. But it moved. That was enough. He tightened his grip on the wheel and pushed forward. The first cries came faintly at first. The wind carried them, thin, desperate voices, twisting between the roars of water and thunder. Tom snapped his head toward the sound. A cluster of searchlight beams swept the area, and after a moment he saw them. 3 figures clinging to a rooftop. The water surged up the sides, threatening to swallow it entirely. Tom felt a jolt of adrenaline, turned the wheel sharply, and guided the ship toward them. As he approached, he slowed the vessel, letting it drift closer with calculated caution. The rooftop bobbed like a ragged platform in the water, each wave threatening to tear it apart. Tom grabbed a rope, tied it around a cleat on the deck, and hurled the loose end toward the survivors. "Grab it!" he shouted, though his voice barely carried over the storm. The rope landed within reach, and one of the figures, a man, lunged for it. The other 2, a woman and a small girl, clung tightly to him as he wrapped the rope around his arm. Tom anchored the rope, braced his feet, and pulled with everything he had. The current tugged mercilessly at the rooftop, trying to drag it away, but Tom grit his teeth, muscles straining. Inch by inch, the survivors were pulled toward the ship's side. Once close enough, Tom reached down, grabbed the man's wrist, and hoisted him up. The woman followed, trembling and soaked, clutching the little girl to her chest. Tom guided them onto the deck, checking them over quickly. They were shaking, disoriented, but alive. He had no time for comfort or reassurance. More cries rose through the storm, closer this time. Tom ushered the rescued family toward the relative safety of the interior corridor and dashed back toward the helm. His heart thundered in his chest. He swung the ship's lights toward the sound and saw yet another cluster of people neighbors he recognized, huddled atop a tractor's roof as the floodwaters licked at the tires beneath them. He guided the ship toward them, repeating the rescue process. Rope, pull, lift, shelter. Each rescue made the ship feel smaller, more cramped, and yet Tom felt stronger with each life he pulled from the storm's jaws. The ship rocked under the weight of the waves and the frantic movements of the survivors, but it held. Hour after hour he moved through the valley, searching, rescuing, listening for shouts, lights, movement, any sign of life. He found a couple trapped in an attic, water rising to their shoulders. He broke the window with a crowbar, pulled them out, and brought them aboard. He found a man clinging to the remnants of a front porch and nearly lost him to a violent surge that slammed the debris against the hull. His arms burned with effort as he dragged the man safely aboard. He found a mother holding a toddler above her head as water swallowed her waist. Tom jumped from the deck into knee-high water, waded against the current, grabbed them both, and fought his way back to the ship, coughing as the rain battered his face. When he returned to the deck, shaking with cold and exhaustion, the mother collapsed against him in gratitude, sobbing into his chest. But Tom had no time to stop. There were more voices, more shadows in the storm. The world beyond the ship seemed endless, dark water stretching toward the horizon, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of rooftops, treetops, and debris. The storm would not relent. The wind pierced through every layer of clothing, and Tom's muscles trembled from strain and cold. But he kept going, fueled by something deeper than instinct, something close to duty, but thicker, heavier. The world had collapsed into disaster, and whether by fate or coincidence, he had been given the means to fight it. The night dragged on in fragments, a rhythm of steering, searching, pulling, and comforting. Each rescue became harder. The water level rose unpredictably. Shifting currents slammed against the hull without warning, and debris sometimes lodged itself perilously close to the ship's propellers. Tom had to navigate around floating cars, sections of fences, and uprooted trees that bobbed dangerously near. At one point, the ship lurched violently as a massive surge hit it from the side, nearly knocking Tom off his feet. The survivors inside cried out in fear. He steadied himself, grabbed the controls, and fought the wheel with everything he had. The water roared as it pushed the vessel sideways, lifting it briefly before slamming it down again. Water splashed over the deck, battering the railings, but the hull held. The metal groaned like a wounded animal, but it held. Tom's breath came in a ragged gasp. He felt the ache deep in his arms, his back, the burning in his lungs from the cold air. But he refused to stop. He forced the ship upright, adjusting its bow against the current, and pushed forward into the night. Somewhere between rescuing a trapped teenager from a drifting pickup truck and hauling an elderly couple from the top of their submerged porch, Tom realized he had completed 3 full circuits of the valley. The ship was filled with people wet, terrified, clinging to each other while water dripped from their clothes onto the metal floors. The wheelhouse glowed faintly with the reflections of the searchlights as Tom guided the vessel toward higher ground. There, a small hill stood among the chaos, one of the only places where the water had not yet reached. He navigated the ship carefully until its hull scraped gently against the slope. He shouted to the survivors, telling them to climb down the ladder one at a time and stay together on the hill. Many wept as they stepped off the ship, kissing the wet grass beneath them. Some looked back at Tom with an expression that made his chest ache. Gratitude, disbelief, awe. Tom stayed aboard only long enough to ensure they were safe. Then he pushed the ship off the hillside, letting the current pull it back into the water. There were more people out there, more voices he had yet to hear, more lives that needed saving. He turned the wheel again and went back into the storm, into the chaos, into the heart of the flooded valley. His father's dream had become his purpose. The ship was no longer just a memory. It was a lifeline. And the night was far from over. Dawn broke slowly, hesitantly, as though the sun itself was unsure if it had permission to return to a world that had been shattered during the night. The storm clouds thinned at last, losing their heavy purple weight and drifting apart in ragged pieces. A pale, exhausted light seeped through them, illuminating the drowned valley in a soft gray glow. The rain had weakened to nothing more than a mist, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Tom could hear something other than the roar of water. It was the sound of quiet, tentative, fragile, but unmistakably real. He stood at the helm of the ship, hunched slightly from exhaustion, his hands still clamped around the wheel even though there was no longer a current fighting against it. His arms trembled, his legs felt hollow. Every muscle in his body ached with a deep, bone-heavy fatigue that went beyond anything he had known before. His throat was raw from shouting over the storm. His eyes burned from the constant sting of wind and rain. But still he stood there, refusing to let himself sit, refusing to let the weight of relief collapse him. Not yet. The survivors he had saved more than he could count, more than he had any right to have saved, were gathered inside the ship's central corridor and storage spaces, wrapped in blankets he had salvaged from sealed containers. Their low voices murmured through the metal walls, subdued and prayer-soft. No one spoke loudly, as though the storm might hear in return. They huddled together, parents clutching children, neighbors supporting one another. Some stared at the floor, still stunned. Others watched Tom through the doorway with quiet, reverent eyes. Tom kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. The floodwaters, once violent and overflowing with rage, had calmed to a restless stillness. The valley was gone, transformed into a muddy inland sea that stretched farther than he could see. Trees poked through the surface like drowned monuments, their branches bent and stripped. Pieces of houses floated aimlessly. Fences lay broken beneath the water, their shapes faintly visible like ghosts. And there, on a hill that had survived the worst of the flood, a cluster of people stood waving frantically at him, calling out with renewed strength as the morning light strengthened. He guided the ship toward them, every motion slow and deliberate. When the hull brushed gently against the hillside, He secured the vessel and lowered the ladder. The people on the hill rushed forward to help the survivors he had already saved, their hands outstretched in relief and gratitude. Some of them embraced those climbing down. Some wept openly. A few simply stood there, overwhelmed by the sight of the ship, this impossible miracle in the middle of farm country. A rusted behemoth that by all logic should never have left the land at all. Tom insisted the injured be helped first. He moved with determination, though his body felt as if it were made of sand. Every step sent a tremor through his muscles. When the last of the survivors stepped off the deck, Tom paused and leaned against the railing, letting the cold metal support him. His heartbeat thudded heavily in his ears. He exhaled and felt for the first time the true weight of what had happened. A voice called his name. He looked up to see Mark Turner trudging through the mud, water sloshing around his boots. His face was streaked with dirt, but his eyes, those clear, earnest eyes, were full of something fierce and unashamedly human. Gratitude, relief, awe. "Tom!" Mark shouted again, breathless as he climbed onto the slope. I can't even begin to." He stopped, shaking his head as though words refused to form. Then he stepped closer and grasped Tom's arm with a shaky hand. "You saved half the valley, probably more. Without you, without that ship." His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. "There'd be nothing left but bodies." Tom swallowed, unable to reply. His throat felt too tight for speech, and even if he could have forced words out, he had no idea what he would say. He wasn't a hero, not in his own mind. He had simply acted because he couldn't imagine doing otherwise. People gathered around him, faces he recognized. Faces he had seen in passing at the market or the gas station. Faces he had pulled from rooftops and porches only hours earlier. They moved toward him like a tide, not aggressively, but with a collective instinctive gratitude that nearly overwhelmed him. A woman gripped his hand and sobbed. A teenage boy whose life he had saved stared at him silently, his eyes shining with something close to reverence. A child, maybe 6 years old, wrapped her arms around his leg, unable to reach any higher, her cheek pressed against his soaked pant leg. More came. More hands touched his shoulders, his arms, the edge of his jacket. More voices whispered his name, some in disbelief, some in relief, some in trembling admiration. He had never been the center of anything in his life. Yet now the entire community, the same people who had laughed at him for buying the ship, stood before him with gratitude so raw and earnest that it left him breathless. He raised a hand faintly, asking them without words to ease their praise. And slowly, gently, they stepped back, respecting him in a way he had never known before. As the morning brightened, helicopters appeared in the distant sky, chopping through the damp air as rescue teams were finally able to reach the valley. Trucks and boats followed from the higher ridges once roads became passable. Emergency workers began coordinating survivors, helping them locate missing relatives, distributing blankets and supplies. But even they seemed struck speechless when they saw the ship rusted, weathered, impossible, resting on the hillside, like some mythic vessel from a storybook. News crews arrived. Cameras pointed, microphones extended, but Tom avoided them all, keeping to the edge of the crowd, his gaze drifting back to the ship again and again. It was battered now, its hull dented in places from debris, its paint scraped, and its ropes frayed. But it had done its job. It had become what his father always dreamed it could be. As the chaos settled, an official from the emergency services approached him, a woman in a heavy rain jacket with a clipboard clutched to her chest. She introduced herself, spoke with calm authority, and then asked if he understood what he had done. Tom nodded gently, though he didn't feel like he had done anything extraordinary. She told him anyway. The ship had directly saved 37 lives. Indirectly, possibly dozens more. He had provided the only mobile refuge for miles. He had bought the rescue teams the time they needed. The valley would rebuild, she said, but without him it would have had far fewer people left to do so. He listened, nodding simply, quietly. There was no pride swelling in his chest, no triumphant joy, only a deep, grounding sense of peace, a sense that something long unresolved had finally settled into place. Later, when the sun finally broke free of the thinning clouds and poured its warm glow across the flooded land, Tom stepped away from the crowd and walked toward the ship one last time. He placed a hand against the metal hull, feeling its cool, damp surface beneath his fingertips. His father had never seen the ocean. He had never stood on a deck like this, never felt the shifting of a vessel beneath his feet. But somehow Tom suspected that if the old man were watching, wherever he was, he would have understood. Perhaps better than anyone. The ship had been a dream once. A foolish dream, people said, but dreams had a way of finding their moment. Tom exhaled slowly, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and whispered quietly into the morning air, "We did it, Dad." When he opened his eyes again, the valley was bathed in the first true sunlight it had seen in weeks. And for the first time since the storm began, the water was finally still. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on the channel. You'll definitely find something that surprises you, and share this video with your friends. Your support really helps the channel grow.